A loving mother suddenly goes missing.
That was just out of character for her.
And I'm like, no, she would never leave the kids.
At this point, everybody is worried.
Soon, police have reason to fear she isn't coming home.
It looked like they were fighting.
She obviously had some concern for her own safety.
The investigation uncovers one horrifying twist after another.
They were drugged just to keep them quiet.
He grabs a knife and threatens to kill her.
She had to escape by jumping out a bathroom window.
They're not dealing with just a normal young man. They're dealing with a monster.
And no amount of justice will ever make up for the wreckage left behind.
He took everything from me.
The children had unfortunately seen too much.
It's like a bad dream.
It will affect them for the rest of their lives.
March 17th, 2013. It's Sunday afternoon in Flint, Michigan, a struggling industrial city an hour northwest of Detroit.
Back in the 60s, Flint, Michigan was thriving. They had at that time a little over 200,000 residents.
Unfortunately, all their financial eggs were in the big General Motors basket. When GM left town, it kind of took a lot of jobs with it.
They lost a lot of population. Neighborhoods were deteriorating, homes shutting down. Ultimately, that just continued throughout the 80s and 90s.
By 2013, the population had dwindled to about 100,000.
And now another one of the city's residents has disappeared.
27-year-old mother Tanisha Colton had been missing for several days.
After 48 hours with no contact, Tanisha's sister and her boyfriend's mother arrive at the Flint police station to file a report.
We're here to file a missing persons report.
They explained to detectives that Tanisha's boyfriend, Henry Connor, had shown up at his mother's home with the couple's children.
He said, I haven't seen Tanisha since Friday night.
And he had been unable to reach her.
Desperate to locate Tanisha, Henry and his mother got Tanisha's sister involved.
I don't know what could have happened. So I kept calling her. I was calling all the time.
She didn't answer the phone, which is very unusual for her. Nobody's heard from her.
To Tanisha's family, her absence without explanation is deeply troubling.
Tanisha had 3 children that she loved very much.
She built her life around her children.
I just knew she wasn't gonna leave her kids. So I knew something was wrong.
"27-year-old Tanisha Colton grew up in a big and loving family of 7 brothers and sisters.
She's the oldest girl. She was like the glue, I would say, for all the siblings.
Warm and vibrant, she was the kind of person who lit up the room.
She was so funny. So funny. She was just like a beautiful spirit. Always singing. She had a beautiful, beautiful voice. Very special. Very special.
She and her longtime boyfriend, Henry Connor, were each other's first loves.
They were high school sweethearts.
They were just always together. Like, wherever you've seen Tanisha, you've seen Henry.
And while many young couples' love quickly fades, theirs endured even through challenging times.
Straight out of high school, she had a young child with Henry. She was only 18 years old.
If you have a child at age 18, the statistics show staying together is not very likely.
But within 1 year, they then welcomed a second child.
They were devoted to being a family and raising their children together.
And Tanisha was made for motherhood.
She was super active in the kids' lives. She poured her entire life and love into her children.
She just was like the best mom.
At the same time, Henry was building a bright future for himself and his family.
Henry actually went to school, graduated from college with a degree in forensic science.
Then in 2012, with the couple thriving, they decided it was time to grow their family again.
They welcome a third baby into the picture.
After spending years caring for her babies, Tanisha decided to go to school to ensure she could help give them the best of everything.
She worked hard to better herself and make a better life for her children.
She received her certified nursing assistant's degree.
In her new career, Tanisha was a star.
Being a certified nursing assistant is not for the faint of heart, but Tanisha was really good at what she did.
At the nursing home, everyone spoke highly of her.
She loved everything about her job, her patients, her employer.
She loved going to work every single day.
It seemed the sky was the limit for Tanisha and her beautiful family.
Her life was on the right track, and she was looking forward to a bright future.
But now, this woman who seemed to have everything has gone missing.
Does your son have any idea why Tanisha might have left?
Yes, sir.
She said they had a small argument.
But he has no idea where she went.
No.
But according to Henry, Tanisha didn't leave alone.
Someone picked Tanisha up outside of their house. But Henry says he really has no idea of who the person was.
Fresh off the birth of their third child, things looked bright for high school sweethearts Tanisha Colton and Henry Connor.
Unlike other high school sweethearts who kind of make up to break up, they stuck together.
She started a new position at a Flint nursing home. Their life was going really well.
Only now, Tanisha's sister and her boyfriend's mother have reported her missing to the Flint police.
According to Henry's mom, Tanisha and Henry got in an argument Friday night and she just left the house. Someone picked Tanisha up, but Henry really has no idea of who the person was.
Unable to reach Tanisha, her sister and boyfriend's mother had first gone to the nursing home where she worked to see if she might be there.
Not only was she not there, but she was a no-call, no-show to work on Friday.
And that was reason for concern for both her supervisor and her family.
That was just out of character for her not to show up.
She was a good employee. She always showed up at work. She never called off.
Her boss at the time suggests that they go to the Flint Police Department.
And then that's when we came to you.
Her family's concerns certainly raise questions. To gain additional perspective, detectives need to understand more about the days leading up to her disappearance.
We'd have to look a little deeper into the facts of the case, or what we know at that time.
The detective would need to take a look at the story that Henry tells and interview Henry.
We tried to establish a timeline from the last time he'd seen Tanisha and what they had done throughout that week leading up to her last being seen.
But when asked specifically about the argument his mother mentioned, Henry makes it seem like it was no big deal.
He never noted anything throughout the week of any significance, no disagreements really, that it was pretty much business as normal until we got right up to the last day that she was seen. He was very vague in his statements, but he did make reference indicating that they'd been arguing.
However, he says when the argument escalated, they both just walked away.
He went to the bedroom.
Then he heard her leave the house.
Henry assumed she had driven off in her vehicle until the next morning when he saw it still parked out front.
She didn't take her car, so someone must have picked her up.
And you have no idea who that could be?
No.
But he thought no matter what, Tanisha would have been back by now.
It's been almost 48 hours.
She was a very devoted mom. And all she took was her purse and her phone.
Under the circumstances, it still seems possible Tanisha left to get some air.
Tanisha was feeling a good deal of pressure. She had 3 children. She had a job.
But police still can't rule out she might be in danger.
They need to find out, who did she leave with? Was she with a friend?
Or was she with someone who didn't have her best interest at heart?
Was she in an accident? Or could she have fallen victim to a random crime?
At the time, Flint was one of the most violent cities in the United States.
Of course, there's another theory investigators can't rule out.
Maybe there was something more to this argument with Henry. Did he know where she was? Did he have something to do with her disappearance?
When police check his criminal record, it is mostly clean.
As far as his criminal history, he had had some misdemeanor warrants, some things, but nothing that had immediately raised any flags to us.
With nothing to indicate what really happened to Tanisha, police place a priority on trying to find her.
There was be on the lookout.
We set it up to broadcast through the LEAN system.
LEAN is an acronym for Law Enforcement Information Network.
It will connect us to all police agencies throughout the United States. It's a very rapid way of getting out information on a missing person.
Law enforcement also contacts local hospitals.
There is nobody by the name of Tanisha Colton admitted or in the ER.
So detectives head to Tanisha's work to interview her supervisor.
We'd like to ask you some questions.
Sure.
When was the last time you saw Tanisha?
I actually saw Tanisha Wednesday night after her shift.
Thursday was her day off, and Friday she was a no-show.
And that's unusual?
Yes, very unusual.
She was very concerned.
This wasn't like Tanisha.
She was a model employee. She never had not shown up to work.
That was one reason her supervisor suggested Tanisha's family call the police. Although she now admits there was more to it.
Tanisha's supervisor said that Tanisha and her boyfriend were walking out at the same time in front of her on Wednesday. She said it looked like they were fighting. It was clear that Tanisha was really upset. And when they got in the car, this argument continued.
She said Tanisha was very animated, was speaking a lot with her hands and her arms.
Police wonder what this argument was about.
This would be important to an investigator because it might establish a motive for Tanisha being missing.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
But detectives have even more to consider when the family of a man named Marcus contacts police.
Marcus is also a certified nursing assistant, and he'd worked at the same nursing home as Tanisha.
Turns out that Marcus is also missing.
In Flint, Michigan, detectives have received word that 27-year-old Tanisha Colton isn't the only worker from a local nursing home that has recently gone missing.
Turns out that Marcus, who's a 26-year-old male, is also missing.
Could there be a connection between the two cases?
2 people from the same staff going missing around the same time seems unlikely to be a coincidence.
Is this a possible love triangle?
I'll see you then.
Hoping to learn more, investigators meet with Marcus's girlfriend, Kenya.
She's very concerned that he's gone missing.
So you don't think he left voluntarily?
No way. He's devoted to this family.
Kenya states that she and Marcus have been dating for 5 years, and they have 2 beautiful children together. They also have 1 on the way.
When they ask more about Marcus's job at the nursing home, Kenya reveals he quit last fall.
That would be a few months before Tanisha started working there.
Maybe their simultaneous disappearances are just a coincidence after all. But then Kenya mentions the circumstances around Marcus's disappearance.
Marcus left their apartment after receiving a phone call. Kenya did not know who called Marcus.
He didn't state who it was. He just said that the person called him and needed a ride. Was it possible that the person on the phone was Tanisha?
Do you know if Marcus knew anyone named Tanisha Colton?
Doesn't ring a bell.
To see if there might be a connection between the two, police subpoena bank and phone records for Tanisha.
Was there a record of them having called each other?
But the question of Marcus's whereabouts doesn't remain a mystery for long.
2 days after he's reported missing, police find his car in a Flint trailer park. They search the area,
and his body is found underneath of a vacant trailer.
He's dead, and his injury is a gunshot wound.
Nothing at the scene seems to connect him to Tanisha.
There is no evidence that might indicate they were together or even knew each other.
But when Tanisha's bank records return, questions resurface.
Thursday, Tanisha's bank card has been used at a gas station off of I-75, about 30 minutes from Flint. And then a few hours later, her bank card has been declined at a hotel in Toledo, Ohio.
Looking for answers, police head to the hotel in Toledo.
When they get there, they speak with an employee who was working that Thursday.
He's like, oh yeah, I remember that night.
Actually was a little odd.
He said a man came in and asked if they had a room available. When he said yes, the man presented Tanisha's ID and debit card saying that his wife was in the car.
He said she was 8 months pregnant and was sleeping. And the clerk said that he would go ahead and do the transaction. However, she would have to come in and sign for the card because her name was on it.
The clerk says that as he ran the card, the man went back outside to wake his wife.
He was outside for a short amount of time, came back in, said that she was not waking up.
The man requested that the clerk just go through with the transaction and give him the keys. But the clerk declined, saying, no, we can't operate like that. He had to follow protocol.
What did the man do then?
He gave up and left.
But police aren't sure what to make of this man and his story.
Did you believe his wife was out in the car?
Yeah, actually I did.
He looked out the window and he could see that the passenger side chair was leaning all the way back. So he figured that this young lady was asleep in the car.
Can you give us a description of the man and the car?
Yeah, it was a black.
He describes him as a young black male with a short haircut.
That could fit the description of Marcus.
He also provides a description of the car that matches Tanisha's.
Hoping to determine once and for all who the man with Tanisha was, investigators asked to view the hotel's surveillance footage. And what they find is unexpected.
When they look, there's no doubt of who tried to check into this hotel. But it was not Marcus. It was Tanisha's boyfriend, Henry Connor.
Detectives in Flint, Michigan have just discovered that Tanisha Colton's boyfriend, Henry Connor, tried to use her bank card at a hotel in Toledo, Ohio on Thursday, March 14th.
Henry said that he had come in to rent a room for the night. And when it came time to reserving and paying for the room, he went to use Tanisha's card. Henry had told the clerk she was out in the car and was sleeping.
But investigators aren't so sure.
Witnesses stated that on Wednesday, Tanisha was seen fighting with Henry while leaving work.
This was the last time she was seen by anybody other than Henry.
But what happened to her after that?
While detectives don't know, they suspect she was not in the car alive and well on Thursday with Henry.
He's very much a suspect now in her disappearance.
When phone records returned for Tanisha, they put to rest any lingering notions of a relationship with Marcus.
There were no calls between the two. There's no evidence or link that they even knew one another. So at this point, police are convinced that these were two separate cases.
Her phone records, however, do prove that Henry has been lying to police.
He told them that on Friday night, Tanisha left with someone, but there were no calls supporting that story.
There is no record of Tanisha making a phone call to anyone on Friday night.
And now police are about to catch Henry in another lie.
On Sunday, Henry had driven the kids to his mother's house in Tanisha's car and then left it there.
Before the police could get to it, my cousins had it towed to my grandmother's house.
So it took police a minute to recover the car and search it. But when they finally did, they found something highly incriminating inside.
Her purse was in there.
But Henry said Tanisha took her purse when she left.
With suspicion mounting against Henry, detectives have little choice but to turn to the best possible witness they have.
This would be Tanisha's oldest child, her daughter.
For her interview, detectives bring her to the Weiss Advocacy Center.
It's a very delicate situation because when dealing with children, there's a process and procedure that police have to go through.
The Weiss Advocacy Center is well known in the state for forensic investigations involving children. They're much more in tune to the questions, the needs, the feelings that children will have.
The psychiatrist asks her to walk through what happened Wednesday after school.
She stated that when they got home, her mom and dad were arguing.
And it seemed to be quite heated, but then things calmed down quite a bit.
But what the little girl says next raises red flags for detectives.
She says her mom put her to bed that night.
She told her daughter that she loved her very much and that she needed to make sure to look after her sister and brother, which we thought was a very odd statement.
The child says after being tucked in, she fell asleep, but was awoken in the middle of the night.
She couldn't tell me exactly what time, but her dad had come in, was quite agitated.
Get dressed, we're going on a trip, okay?
He told them to get dressed and that they were going on a trip, going out of town.
Outside, the little girl describes how her father loaded them into the car. But one member of the family was notably absent.
She vividly remembered her mother was not with them.
Afterwards, the child describes going on a long drive.
During this drive, she said he made a stop.
Her dad had her mom's purse and took money out of it.
Ultimately, he gives them something that's green and tasted very nasty.
After that, the child recalls drifting in and out.
She recalled sleeping in a parking lot next to a big brown building with lots of windows, which we surmised was the hotel that Henry was trying to check into.
Tanisha's daughter also recalls that when she woke up in the early morning hours, the car was surrounded by tall grass.
And she saw a building with a bunch of flags outside.
Next thing she knew, they were all arriving back home.
But her mom was not there.
I do remember asking if she had any idea where her mother was at, and she did not know.
When detectives return to the station, what they find inside Tanisha's purse gives even greater credence to the child's story.
There's a receipt in the purse from a Toledo convenience store.
The receipt shows a purchase for cough medicine.
Obviously, this is the green medicine that was given to the children during this long drive.
The children were basically getting drugged to keep them knocked out. He doesn't want them to remember what he's going to do with Tanisha's body.
Armed with this evidence, police speak with their prime suspect.
He agreed to talk to us.
When told that his daughter said he and Tanisha fought on Wednesday, he doesn't deny it.
Earlier in the week, he said that they'd had a couple of arguments.
He also admits the family had gone for a drive on Thursday. But then, his story begins to veer away from his daughters.
Henry states that they actually kept the children home from school on Thursday, and that he, Tanisha, and the children went for a ride around. They'd stayed around the Flint area.
So detectives confront him with the bank card transactions that place him near Toledo.
He begins to backtrack.
I don't know. I guess I drove a little further than I thought.
But it's when they mention Tanisha's purse and the receipts found inside that Henry shuts down.
He terminated the interview and requested a lawyer.
With no body, police can't make an arrest for murder. But they do have another way to hold Henry.
Police are able to get Henry on child abuse charges.
As news of Henry's arrest spreads, detectives receive a surprising phone call from a friend of Tanisha's.
She was pretty confident that Henry had done something to hurt Tanisha.
There were a lot of incidents that really show and portray a very violent relationship.
Tanisha was afraid for her life.
Don't you think I'm stupid?
A friend of Tanisha Colton's has just told detectives about the tumultuous relationship between the missing mother and her boyfriend, Henry Connor.
Her friend describes how Tanisha complained about a lot of emotional abuse.
Tanisha has told her stories about the violence that has happened.
She was afraid that Henry possibly could have hurt her because he'd been physically abusive in the past.
She once saw Tanisha with a split lip and a bruise on the side of her face. And Tanisha had told her that they had gotten into a fight.
There was even another incident where he actually punched her so hard as she's driving the car that she hits her head against the driver's side window and almost crashes the vehicle.
Also, at one point, she had to escape him by jumping out a bathroom window.
But one story she tells in particular shows police just how far Henry was willing to go.
One night, Tanisha and Henry are headed out.
They were getting into the car. Tanisha forgot the baby's bag and went back inside. While she was inside, Henry went through her phone messages.
When Tanisha comes back out to the vehicle, Henry starts screaming at her.
Why are you texting other guys?
What? That was for work.
Don't lie to me.
She's afraid. She runs and he chases after her with a knife and threatens to kill her.
You need to calm down. I have no idea.
You think I'm stupid?
You need to stop.
She is trying to get away from Henry.
Henry grabs Tanisha, pulling her back towards their home.
While it sounds like Tanisha was trapped in a torturous cycle of abuse, her friend explains that her ultimate goal was to leave.
Back during Christmas of 2012, Tanisha had reached out to her and said, "Look, I have to get out of this."
She was very strong and a determined young lady. She had a plan in place.
She was looking at different houses and was saving up money in hopes that she can get away from Henry.
But the best laid plans can easily unravel.
Henry found out about Tanisha wanting to leave. He gets even more possessive of her, and he just becomes even more physically violent. The most dangerous time for a woman who is involved in a domestic violence situation is right before she's going to leave.
That these type of situations end in a death is not uncommon.
Still, Tanisha's family refuses to give up hope.
We made flyers. We went into a lot of abandoned buildings, houses, fields.
Tierra and the family does some Facebook posts.
Along the way, the family is touched to have strong community support.
The community really pulled together for her. There were a lot of searches. They had police lines.
It was broadcast on the local news stations. The entire community was very concerned about what had happened to Tanisha Colton.
It was so beautiful to see a city rally behind a mother that they know is a good mother. And her children, they wanted to protect them as well as find her.
The search is still underway when on March 25th, a shocking discovery occurs 70 miles from Flint in the rural town of Carlton.
There was someone driving on this country road. He notices what he thought was some debris or that someone had dumped some trash along the road.
People thinking.
But when he looks closer, he makes a gruesome discovery.
It's not the garbage that he thought it was, actually. It's a woman's dead body.
On March 25th, not quite 2 weeks after Tanisha Colton disappeared, a passing motorist spots a woman's dead body lying in a ditch beside a country road.
She was wrapped up in some type of bedding.
She is face down in the ditch.
He immediately contacted the police.
As the medical examiner looks over the body, there are clear signs of trauma.
The cause of death was not immediately obvious, but they did note something distinctive on the body that might help identify her.
She had a tattoo under her right eye of 3 stars.
Authorities are actually able to identify her as Tanisha Colton due to those very specific tattoos.
With Tanisha's body removed for autopsy, state police contact the Flint detectives, who immediately head to the scene.
We were actually off duty and came into work to drive down.
And nearby, they find plenty to corroborate Henry's daughter's story.
There was tall grass in the area.
And just as Tanisha's daughter had reported, they do find a building with several flags.
They're beginning to connect the dots.
But Flint detectives now face the difficult task of notifying Tanisha's family.
Death notifications are probably up in the top 3 worst parts of doing our job. Especially with a family like this, you could tell that they were close-knit just by the concern that they were conveying to us.
Part of me was relieved they found her, but then I knew I was never going to see her again. So that's still something I'm struggling with because she was my best friend.
Her family is also saddened that Tanisha never shared with them how bad things really were.
We were in the dark. I really feel like she felt she was alone or that she didn't have anybody that she could go to. So I really wish that I could tell her that she did, that she didn't have to be so closed in or private.
When autopsy results return, Tanisha's exact cause of death remains unclear.
The chief medical examiner determined it to be undetermined, but found the manner of death to be homicide. And she could not rule out asphyxia.
With the autopsy complete, the case against Henry moves forward.
He was charged with the homicide of Tanisha Colton.
There are no charges, however, against him in Marcus's murder.
Police arrested another man for Marcus's murder.
In the end, the deaths of these 2 healthcare workers from the same facility were just a very sad coincidence.
Marcus's death had nothing to do with Tanisha.
But police remain certain they have the right man in Tanisha's murder.
Based on the evidence, detectives believe that Tanisha wanted out of the abusive relationship.
Henry was not going to accept it. He was not going to be in control anymore.
So he ultimately killed her.
Prosecutors suspect that when Tanisha and Henry left the nursing home on March 13th, they were arguing about her plans to leave him.
That argument transferred all the way into their home.
Once the kids were in bed, things only escalated.
Henry did harm to Tanisha. He possibly used an object, or he used his hands to asphyxiate or strangle her.
If you want to cause that type of harm to a young lady, it doesn't take a lot of effort, unfortunately.
Realizing what he had done, Henry panicked.
He took her body to her vehicle, put her into the trunk of the car, then returned back to the house. He woke the children back up, put them in the vehicle.
On their drive, he stopped at a gas station where he bought cough syrup to silence his children.
They were drugged just to keep him quiet so he could do the things that he did.
But prosecutors presume that before he could dispose of the body, exhaustion overtook him. So Henry attempted to check into a hotel with Tanisha's card.
But the clerk was not going to allow him to purchase that room unless the car holder was actually the one who came in and signed.
At that point, Henry gave up and just left.
Then, after sleeping in the car, Henry disposed of Tanisha's body.
He ultimately dumps her body just outside of Toledo in Carlton, Michigan, and then heads back home to Flint.
The case against him is strong.
Not only do they have Henry lying in his statement, they also have the evidence of the daughter.
The electronic evidence of the use of her ATM card, the interview of the hotel clerk, and the receipts that were located in Tanisha's purse.
Then ultimately they have her body that they found.
All the evidence, I just couldn't believe it.
There is no doubt that Henry committed this murder.
The prosecution considers offering Henry a plea deal in order to spare his young daughter from taking the stand.
Some closure was needed at this point in time.
The prosecutor does ultimately offer Henry a second-degree murder charge, which he accepts.
On July 25th, 2016, Henry receives a sentence of 25 to 50 years in prison.
That doesn't mean he's going to get out in the 25 years. It just simply means he would go in front of the parole board and they would make the determination of when he would be out.
Although Tanisha's family is relieved to see Henry where he belongs, it doesn't change the fact that her children will grow up without their mother.
Her sister was doing her best to try to raise them, but she had a family of her own and just didn't have the ability to take on the 3 children.
They did get adopted, and they were together. We made sure of that. We got to actually pick who we wanted them to go with.
But through the years, Tanisha's family has remained deeply involved in their lives.
I just tried to give words of encouragement, but they're gravely affected, which who wouldn't be, you know?
They've lost their father, too, to prison sentence because of his murdering their mother.
I just pray for their well-being, their strength, for them to, get over hurdles, just to be everything that they can be for their mom, because she was just a bright light.
In December 2000, Wichita, Kansas, looked much like countless other American cities preparing for the holidays. Streets were lined with bare trees. Neighborhoods settled into quiet evenings. And winter temperatures pushed residents indoors as Christmas drew closer. For most people, the season carried familiar routines, family dinners, shopping trips, late-night gatherings with friends, and the expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. Yet within the span of only 7 days, that ordinary rhythm would be shattered by a sequence of crimes so brutal that they would forever alter the city's history. What began as an armed robbery would escalate in a murder, kidnapping, sexual violence, and finally a mass execution in a snow-covered field. By the end of that week, 5 people would be dead. 2 others would survive against overwhelming odds, and the case would become one of the most infamous criminal prosecutions in Kansas. More than 2 decades later, the Wichita Massacre remains remembered not because of the men who committed it, but because of the lives that were stolen and the resilience of those who survived long enough to help uncover the truth. This is the story of those 7 days. Before the home invasion that would make national headlines. Before the courtroom battles that would eventually reach the highest courts in the United States. There were smaller crimes that, in hindsight, revealed an alarming pattern. At the center of those crimes were 2 brothers, Reginald Carr, 23 years old, and Jonathan Carr, 20 years old. Both had criminal histories before arriving in Wichita, and, according to the case record, they had only recently moved to the city. Investigators would later determine that robbery was the primary motive behind their crimes. Yet as the events unfolded, it became clear that financial gain alone could not explain the extraordinary level of violence inflicted upon their victims. Each offense grew more severe than the last, creating a terrifying progression that culminated in one of the worst mass murders in Kansas history. The first known victim in this sequence was 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber. He was a baseball coach's assistant, a young man whose day began like any other and who had no reason to believe that he would soon become the first documented survivor in what would later be known as the Wichita Massacre. On December 8, 2000, Andrew encountered the 2 brothers during a carjacking. Armed with firearms, they took control of him and forced him to comply with their demands. Under threat of deadly violence, Andrew was ordered to drive to multiple automated teller machines. At each stop, he withdrew as much money as his accounts would allow. The withdrawals were not voluntary choices, but actions performed under the constant threat of a gun. Once the cash had been taken, the assault continued. Andrew was beaten repeatedly. His watch was stolen along with his money. Eventually, rather than killing him, the brothers abandoned him in a remote location. Alone, injured, and robbed, Andrew survived. At that moment, neither he nor anyone else could have imagined that his ordeal represented only the beginning of a far larger tragedy. His survival would later prove crucial, because he became an important witness whose account helped investigators reconstruct the earliest stage of the crime spree. 3 days later, the violence escalated dramatically. On December 11th, another ordinary evening ended in tragedy for Linda Valenta, 55 years old, and was a respected cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra. Music had long been part of her life, and on that evening she had attended orchestra rehearsal before beginning the familiar drive home. There was nothing unusual about the route she took or the expectation that she would soon arrive safely. But according to the documented facts of the case, the Carr brothers followed her after rehearsal. As Anne reached her home, the 2 men approached under the pretense of asking for directions. It was a simple request, one that most people would consider harmless. When she lowered her car window, the situation changed instantly. A firearm was produced. Faced with immediate danger, and attempted to escape by reversing her vehicle. She never got the opportunity. The brothers opened fire, gravely wounded, and was transported to the hospital. Despite medical treatment, she died several days later from her injuries. Her death marked a devastating turning point. What had begun as robbery and assault had now become homicide. Looking back, investigators would recognize that the level of violence was increasing rapidly. The attacks were becoming bolder, more ruthless, and more unpredictable. Yet the most horrifying events were still to come. As Wichita continued through another ordinary week in December, few residents knew that a dangerous pattern had already begun. The city remained largely unaware that two violent offenders were moving through its neighborhoods, selecting victims who had no connection to them whatsoever. There was no evidence that Andrew Schreiber or Valinda had been specifically targeted because of who they were. Instead, they appeared to have crossed paths with offenders willing to exploit opportunity without hesitation. That randomness would become one of the most frightening aspects of the entire case. It suggested that almost anyone could become a victim under the wrong circumstances. The sense of unpredictability would later deepen the fear experienced throughout Wichita once the full sequence of crimes became public. While Andrew recovered from his injuries and investigators worked to understand the shooting of Valinda, another group of individuals continued living their ordinary lives, completely unaware that they would soon become part of one of the darkest chapters in Kansas history. Aaron Sander was 29 years old. Brad Heike was 27. Jason Beffert was 26. Heather Muller was 25. Alongside them was another woman whose identity has remained protected in public records. None of these five people knew Reginald Carr or Jonathan Carr. According to the documented information available, there was no personal connection between the victims and the offenders. Their lives simply intersected through what investigators later described as an apparently random choice of location. That fact remains one of the most chilling elements of the case. There was no long-standing conflict, no personal motive, no history that connected either side. Ordinary people, spending time together in a private home during a cold December night, would unknowingly become the targets of unimaginable violence. As the evening of December 14th approached, Wichita continued preparing for the holidays. Families gathered indoors to escape the freezing temperatures. Friends visited one another. Winter darkness settled over residential neighborhoods much earlier than during the summer months. It was a setting that appeared peaceful from the outside. Yet beneath that quiet surface, the crime spree that had begun only days earlier was approaching its final and most devastating stage. The transition from robbery to murder had already occurred. The next escalation would leave an entire community searching for answers and forever change the lives of every family connected to the victims. In the next chapter, the events of December 14th would unfold hour by hour, revealing how an armed home invasion evolved into one of the most horrifying mass killings in modern Kansas history. By the evening of December 14th, 2000, the pattern of violence had already become unmistakable, even though the broader public did not yet know it. Within the space of a single week, an armed robbery had been followed by a fatal shooting. Yet nothing that had happened during those previous days could fully prepare Wichita for what was about to unfold. The crimes committed on the night of December 14th would transform an already serious investigation into one of the most notorious criminal cases in Kansas history. At a residence in Wichita, 5 people had gathered together. 3 men, Aaron Sander, 29 years old, Brad Heike, 27, and Jason Beffert, 26, were inside the home. They were later joined by 2 women, including 25-year-old Heather Muller and another woman whose identity has remained protected in public records. There was nothing in the available evidence to suggest that any of them expected danger that night. According to the documented facts of the case, none of the 5 victims knew Reginald Carr or Jonathan Carr. There was no personal relationship, no previous dispute, and no indication that they had been deliberately selected because of who they were. Investigators would later conclude that the house itself appeared to have been chosen almost at random. That single fact has remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the Wichita Massacre. The victims were not drawn into danger by personal choices or ongoing conflicts. Instead, they found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, confronted by offenders whose willingness to use violence had already escalated dramatically over the preceding days. At approximately 11:00 p.m., the quiet of the evening was broken when the two armed brothers entered the residence. Almost immediately, they established complete control over everyone inside. Armed with firearms, they forced all 5 victims into submission. The occupants were restrained, preventing any realistic opportunity to resist or escape. The offenders searched the residence, taking money and valuables in what initially appeared to be an armed robbery. Had the crime ended there, it would already have been a traumatic experience that would leave lasting emotional scars. But according to the court records, the robbery became only one part of a much longer ordeal. As the hours passed, the victims remained under constant threat. The uncertainty they faced became a weapon in itself. They had no way of knowing whether they would eventually be released, whether the offenders intended only to steal property, or whether something even worse awaited them. The available case records describe an extended period during which the 5 victims endured repeated threats and humiliation. The psychological impact of those hours is difficult to measure. Every passing minute prolonged the uncertainty. Every action by the offenders reinforced the victims' complete loss of control over their own fate. Court records further established that during the captivity, the offenders subjected members of the group to acts of sexual violence and humiliation. These crimes formed a significant part of the later prosecution and contributed to the profound shock that the case generated throughout the country. Out of respect for the victims, it is neither necessary nor appropriate to describe those assaults in graphic detail. What matters is the documented reality that the violence extended far beyond robbery. The offenders inflicted physical, psychological, and sexual abuse upon people who were entirely defenseless. The suffering endured inside that house continued for hours, turning what might have begun as a property crime into an extended episode of terror. Throughout the night, the offenders maintained absolute control. Every decision rested with them, while the victims were left with only uncertainty. According to the documented evidence, the group was repeatedly threatened, leaving them unable to predict what would happen next. For investigators reviewing the case later, this prolonged captivity became an important indication that the violence was escalating well beyond any practical objective. The robbery had already succeeded. Property had already been taken. Yet the offenders continued to hold the victims, extending the ordeal rather than ending it. Eventually, the crimes expanded beyond the walls of the residence. The offenders forced some of the victims into vehicles and drove them to several automated teller machines. Under armed supervision, money was withdrawn from bank accounts. This mirrored the earlier crime committed against Andrew Schreiber on December 8th, when he too had been forced to visit multiple ATMs before being robbed and abandoned. The repetition of this method demonstrated a consistent pattern in the offender's conduct. Financial gain remained one objective, but once again the violence did not stop after the money had been obtained. Following the ATM withdrawals, the victims were brought back to the residence. At that point, the offenders had already succeeded in stealing property and cash. From a purely criminal perspective, they had accomplished the apparent purpose of the robbery. Yet the events that followed would reveal that the danger facing the 5 captives was far from over. As the night stretched into the early hours of December 15th, a decision was made that would determine the fate of nearly everyone inside the house. The 2 brothers bound all 5 victims and forced them into vehicles. Rather than leaving them behind or fleeing with the stolen property, they transported the entire group away from the residence. The destination was a snow-covered soccer field in the northeastern part of Wichita. Winter conditions had already settled across Kansas. Temperatures had dropped below freezing, and the ground was covered with snow. Even under ordinary circumstances, the environment would have been harsh. 4 or 5 restrained captives surrounded by armed offenders. It offered almost no realistic possibility of escape. The isolation of the location added another layer of vulnerability. Far from the neighborhood where they had been taken hostage, the victims found themselves standing in an open area where there were no immediate opportunities to seek help. According to the documented sequence of events, the 5 victims were positioned together on the snow-covered field. Then the offenders opened fire at close range. Aaron Sander was killed. Brad Heike was killed. Jason Beffert was killed. Heather Muller was killed. The second female victim was also shot. Unlike the others, however, she survived, wounded and surrounded by the bodies of the other victims. She made an extraordinary decision that would ultimately alter the course of the investigation. Rather than revealing that she was still alive, she remained motionless, pretending to be dead until she believed the offenders had left the scene. It was an act born entirely from survival. Once she was convinced that the immediate danger had passed, she rose despite her injuries. Alone in freezing conditions, she began searching for help. Every step through the snow represented an effort to stay alive long enough to reach safety. Eventually, she reached a nearby residence and sought assistance. Her survival became one of the defining moments of the Wichita Massacre. She was not only the sole survivor of the execution at the soccer field, but also a critical eyewitness whose account would later provide investigators with invaluable information about what had occurred. Her testimony, combined with the physical evidence recovered during the investigation, would become central to identifying and prosecuting the offenders. By the time daylight returned to Wichita on December 15th, the city was confronting a crime unlike any it had experienced in recent memory. 4 people had been killed in the snow-covered field after enduring hours of captivity, while another victim had survived under extraordinary circumstances. Combined with the earlier crimes committed against Andrew Schreiber and Linda and Valenta, the attacks demonstrated a rapid and terrifying escalation over the course of just 1 week. The question facing law enforcement was no longer simply who had committed these crimes, but how quickly they could be identified before anyone else became a victim. In the next chapter, investigators would begin assembling the evidence, drawing upon survivor testimony, fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property to trace the path that ultimately led to the rapid identification and arrest of Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr only 1 day after the massacre. The hours immediately following the shootings marked the beginning of an investigation that would move with extraordinary speed. By the time the surviving victim reached safety after walking through the freezing Kansas night, the scale of the tragedy had already become apparent. Law enforcement officers responding to the report were no longer dealing with a single violent crime. They were confronting a series of connected offenses that had unfolded over 7 days and had escalated from robbery and assault to multiple homicides. The discovery of 4 victims at the snow-covered soccer field, combined with the earlier attack that had claimed the life of Linda and Valenta and the armed robbery and kidnapping of Andrew Schreiber, forced investigators to consider the possibility that they were searching for offenders responsible for an organized and rapidly escalating crime spree. The surviving woman's account became the investigation's first and most immediate source of information. Although she had endured hours of captivity, repeated threats, and a gunshot wound, she was able to tell investigators that 2 armed men had invaded the residence, restrained the victims, robbed them, forced some of them to withdraw money from automated teller machines, return to the house, and ultimately transported everyone to the isolated field where the shootings occurred. Her testimony established that the crimes had not been spontaneous acts of violence, but a sequence of deliberate decisions carried out over several hours. More importantly, it confirmed that 2 offenders had acted together throughout the entire ordeal. Every detail she could provide helped investigators begin reconstructing the timeline from the home invasion to the final moments at the execution site, while detectives interviewed the surviving witness. crime scene specialists began documenting every piece of physical evidence available. The investigation focused on several key locations rather than a single scene. The residence where the victims had been held captive contained evidence related to the forced entry, the robbery, and the prolonged period of restraint. The ATM locations represented another important series of locations because they reflected the movements of both the offenders and the victims after the home invasion had begun. Finally, the snow-covered soccer field became the scene of the murders themselves, preserving evidence connected to the final stage of the crimes. Each location contributed a different piece of the overall picture, allowing investigators to assemble a comprehensive understanding of what had happened during those terrifying hours. According to the documented facts of the case, investigators recovered multiple categories of evidence that quickly strengthened the case against the offenders. One of the most significant forms of evidence was fingerprints. Fingerprints have long served as one of the most reliable methods of linking individuals to crime scenes. And in this investigation, they became an important component of the developing case. Alongside fingerprint evidence, investigators also recovered DNA evidence. While the available case summary does not describe every item from which DNA was obtained, it confirms that forensic evidence played a central role in identifying those responsible. Physical evidence recovered during the investigation further reinforced the timeline established through witness testimony. In addition, investigators located property connected to the crimes, creating another layer of corroboration. Rather than relying upon a single witness or one isolated clue, detectives were able to compare multiple independent sources of evidence. Each category supported the others. The surviving victim's account aligned with physical findings. The forensic evidence supported the movements described during the interviews. Recovered property connected the offenders to the crimes. This convergence of evidence dramatically increased investigators' confidence that they were moving in the right direction. The earlier crimes committed during the week also became increasingly significant as detectives searched for connections. Andrew Schreiber, who had survived the December 8th kidnapping and robbery, had already experienced many of the same methods later used during the home invasion. He had been confronted at gunpoint, forced to drive to several ATM machines, compelled to withdraw money, assaulted, robbed, and abandoned in a remote area. At the time of his attack, investigators could not have known that his experience represented the opening chapter of a much larger series of crimes. Now, however, detectives could compare his account with the testimony of the surviving victim from the December 14th home invasion. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both incidents involved two armed offenders. Both involved forced ATM withdrawals. Both involved robbery under the threat of deadly violence. These recurring patterns helped establish continuity across the different offenses, allowing investigators to view them as parts of a single criminal spree rather than unrelated crimes. The murder of Linda and Valenta also assumed greater significance within the broader investigation. 3 days after Andrew Schreiber's kidnapping, and had been followed home after orchestra rehearsal, approached under the false pretense of being asked for directions, and shot after attempting to escape. Although the circumstances differed from the robberies, investigators now recognized that the level of violence had increased steadily over the course of the week. The progression became painfully clear. The first known victim had survived robbery and assault. The second victim had been fatally shot. Finally, 5 additional victims had been kidnapped during a home invasion, transported to an isolated field, and shot at close range. This chronological escalation reinforced investigators' determination to locate the offenders as quickly as possible. Every hour that passed raised the possibility that additional innocent people could become victims. Fortunately, the investigation moved far more rapidly than many homicide cases. The combination of eyewitness testimony, fingerprint evidence, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property provided detectives with multiple investigative leads simultaneously. According to the documented record, these combined forms of evidence enabled law enforcement to identify the two suspects in an exceptionally short period of time. Investigators determined that the offenders were Reginald Carr, 23 years old, and his younger brother Jonathan Carr, 20 years old. Both brothers had recently arrived in Wichita before the crimes began. Once investigators focused on them, the evidence developed quickly enough that arrests followed within only one day of the massacre. In many homicide investigations, identifying suspects can require weeks, months, or even years of painstaking work. Some cases remain unsolved despite decades of investigation. The Wichita Massacre followed a different course. Although the crimes themselves were extraordinarily complex and involved multiple victims across several locations, the abundance of available evidence significantly accelerated the investigative process. Rather than depending upon a single breakthrough, detectives were able to rely upon numerous forms of corroborating information. The surviving witness provided a first-hand account. Fingerprints established physical presence. DNA added another scientific layer of identification. Physical evidence recovered from the crime scenes supported the sequence of events. Property connected to the offenses further strengthened the case. Together, these elements created a compelling body of evidence that pointed investigators toward the two brothers responsible for the attacks. The arrests represented a crucial turning point, but they did not erase the devastating consequences already suffered by the victims and their families. 4 people have been killed in the snow-covered field. Linda and Valenta had died from the injuries sustained during the earlier shooting. Andrew Schreiber continued recovering from his kidnapping and assault. Another woman carried both physical injuries and the emotional burden of surviving an execution in which 4 companions lost their lives. The investigation had succeeded in identifying and apprehending the suspects before another known attack could occur. Yet the community now faced the long and difficult process of understanding the full scope of what had happened during that single week in December. With the suspects in custody, the focus of the case shifted from identifying those responsible to proving their guilt before a court of law. Prosecutors now faced the task of presenting the extensive forensic evidence, the testimony of surviving witnesses, and the documented sequence of crimes to a jury. The legal proceedings that followed would involve numerous charges, including capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and related offenses. The outcome would not only determine the fate of Reginald and Jonathan Carr, but would also begin a legal battle over the death penalty that would continue for more than 2 decades, eventually reaching both the United States Supreme Court and the Kansas Supreme Court. When the investigation transitioned into the courtroom, the focus shifted from discovering what had happened to proving it beyond a reasonable doubt. The events of December 2000 had already left an unmistakable mark on Wichita. 5 people had lost their lives during a 7-day crime spree, while 2 survivors carried both physical injuries and memories that would remain with them long after the investigation ended. For the families of those who were killed, the coming trial represented far more than a legal proceeding. It was an opportunity to hear the evidence presented publicly, to understand how the crimes had unfolded, and to seek accountability through the justice system. For prosecutors, the challenge was to organize a complex sequence of events involving multiple crime scenes, numerous victims, and a broad range of criminal offenses into a coherent case that accurately reflected the scope of what had occurred. According to the documented record, the trial took place in 2002. By that point, investigators had assembled a substantial body of evidence gathered during the days immediately following the massacre. Rather than relying on one decisive piece of proof, The prosecution's case rested upon the combination of several independent forms of evidence that supported one another. The testimony of the surviving victims established the sequence of events from firsthand experience. Fingerprint evidence connected the offenders to the crimes. DNA evidence provided additional forensic support. Physical evidence collected throughout the investigation reinforced the timeline that detectives had. Reconstructed property connected to the offenses further strengthened the prosecution's case. Individually, each category of evidence carried significance. Together, they created a detailed picture that prosecutors argued demonstrated the responsibility of Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr for the crimes committed during that week in December. One of the most important elements presented during the proceedings was the testimony of the surviving witnesses. Andrew Schreiber, who had survived the December 8th kidnapping and robbery, provided evidence concerning the earliest known attack in the sequence. His experience demonstrated the methods used by the offenders before the murders occurred. At gunpoint, he had been forced to withdraw money from multiple automated teller machines. Physically assaulted, robbed of his belongings, and abandoned in a remote location. Although he survived, his testimony illustrated the pattern of conduct that investigators later connected to the broader crime spree. The similarities between his experience and the later offenses helped establish continuity across the various crimes considered by the court. Equally significant was the testimony of the woman who survived the shootings on December 15th. Her survival had already transformed the investigation, and her account continued to play a central role during the trial. According to the documented facts of the case, she described how two armed men entered the residence, restrained everyone inside, robbed them, subjected members of the group to prolonged threats and humiliation, forced some victims to withdraw money from automated teller machines, returned to the house, and ultimately transported all 5 captives to the snow-covered soccer field where the shootings occurred. Her account linked every stage of the crime into one continuous sequence. It also confirmed that both offenders acted together throughout the ordeal. The physical evidence recovered during the investigation supported the details she provided, allowing prosecutors to demonstrate consistency between eyewitness testimony and forensic findings. Alongside witness testimony, prosecutors presented the various forensic findings collected during the investigation. Fingerprints, DNA evidence, physical evidence, and recovered property were all introduced as part of the documented case. Although each category of evidence addressed different aspects of the investigation, together they established a network of corroboration rather than relying upon a single source. This combination of scientific and testimonial evidence became one of the defining strengths of the prosecution's presentation. Rather than asking the jury to rely exclusively upon personal recollections, prosecutors were able to demonstrate that independent forensic findings aligned with the testimony given by surviving witnesses. The charges brought against the two brothers reflected the extraordinary breadth of the crimes committed during the week-long spree. According to the documented record, Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr faced numerous serious criminal charges, including capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and additional related offenses. The range of charges reflected the progression of the crimes themselves. The case was not centered on one isolated offense, but on an interconnected series of violent acts that escalated over 7 days. Prosecutors argued that the evidence demonstrated responsibility not only for the killings themselves, but also for the kidnappings, robberies, sexual violence, and other criminal acts committed against multiple victims. Throughout the proceedings, the focus remained on reconstructing the events according to the evidence rather than speculation. Investigators had already established a clear chronology beginning with the robbery and kidnapping of Andrew Schreiber on December 8th, followed by the shooting of Linda and Valenta on December 11th, and culminating in the home invasion, prolonged captivity, forced ATM withdrawals, transportation to the soccer field, and execution-style shootings during the night of December 14th and the early morning of December 15th. This chronological presentation allowed jurors to understand not only the individual crimes, but also how the violence escalated over the course of a single week. The verdict ultimately reflected the strength of the prosecution's case. In 2002, both Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr were convicted of the charges brought against them. The court imposed death sentences upon both brothers. The verdict concluded the trial itself, but it did not bring the legal process to an immediate end. Instead, it marked the beginning of a much longer period of appellate litigation that would continue for decades. Cases involving capital punishment frequently undergo extensive judicial review because of the irreversible nature of the sentence, and the Wichita Massacre proved no exception. The legal questions raised during the appeals would eventually extend far beyond the original trial court, reaching the highest judicial institutions in both Kansas and the United States. Years after the convictions, the case continued moving through the appellate system. One of the most significant developments occurred in 2016, when the United States Supreme Court considered the case in Kansas versus Carr. According to the documented record provided, the court reinstated the death sentences that had previously been overturned at the state level. This decision represented a major milestone in the lengthy legal process, reaffirming the capital sentences imposed after the 2002 convictions. Even after that ruling, however, the litigation did not conclude. Additional legal challenges continued over the following years, reflecting the extensive review that often accompanies death penalty cases in the American judicial system. In 2023, another important chapter closed when the United States Supreme Court declined to hear further direct appeals submitted by the two brothers. Although this did not erase every possible avenue of post-conviction litigation, it represented another significant judicial decision affirming the earlier outcomes. Yet the legal process still continued within the Kansas courts. According to the information provided, in June 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court again upheld the death sentences, bringing another major phase of the appeals process to an end. By that point, more than 25 years had passed since the crimes themselves. During those decades, the legal proceedings evolved into one of the most prominent death penalty cases in Kansas history, illustrating both the complexity and the length of appellate review in capital cases. While the judicial system addressed legal questions through years of appeals, the human consequences of the Wichita Massacre remained unchanged. Court decisions could determine criminal responsibility and appropriate punishment, but they could not restore the lives that had been lost. Aaron Sander, Brad Heike, Jason Beffert, Heather Muller, and Linda and Valenta did not return to their families. Andrew Schreiber continued living with the memory of his kidnapping and assault. The surviving woman who escaped the soccer field carried the experience of enduring hours of captivity and surviving an execution in which 4 companions were killed beside her. The legal process served an essential role in establishing accountability. Yet it also underscored an enduring reality common to many violent crimes: justice, even when achieved through conviction and sentence, cannot erase loss. In the years that followed, the Wichita Massacre came to occupy a lasting place in the history of American true crime, remembered not only for the extraordinary brutality of the offenses, but also for the remarkable survival of a witness whose determination to seek helped transform the investigation, strengthened the prosecution, and ensured that the events of those 7 days would be documented, examined, and remembered with the victims at the center of the story. More than 2 decades have passed since the events of December 2000, yet the Wichita Massacre continues to occupy a distinct place in the history of violent crime in the United States. Tom has altered many aspects of the case. Court proceedings have concluded. Appeals have worked their way through multiple levels of the judicial system, and the legal questions surrounding the death sentences have been examined repeatedly. What has not changed is the impact left behind by a single week of violence that forever reshaped the lives of numerous families and the wider Wichita community. While true crime stories often become remembered for the offenders or the complexity of the investigation, the lasting significance of this case lies elsewhere. It rests in the lives that were interrupted, the ordinary moments that ended without warning, and the remarkable resilience of the individuals who survived long enough to help ensure that the truth could be established. Looking back across the sequence of events, one of the most striking characteristics of the Wichita Massacre is how rapidly the violence escalated. According to the documented record, the known crimes unfolded over only 7 days. On December 8th, Andrew Schreiber survived an armed kidnapping, robbery, and assault after being forced to withdraw money from multiple automated teller machines before being abandoned in a remote area. 3 days later, Linda and Valenta was followed home after orchestra rehearsal, approached under the false pretense of being asked for directions, and fatally shot when she attempted to escape. Only a few days after that, 5 people inside a private residence became victims of an armed home invasion that developed into prolonged captivity. Robbery, forced ATM withdrawals, sexual violence documented in court records, transportation to an isolated location, and the execution-style shootings that claimed 4 lives while leaving 1 woman wounded but alive. The progression from robbery to multiple homicide occurred within the space of a single week. That rapid escalation remains one of the defining characteristics of the case, and one reason it continues to be studied within discussions of violent criminal behavior. Another defining aspect of the Wichita Massacre is the apparent randomness of the victim selection, described in the available record. Andrew Schreiber did not know the offenders. Linda and Valenta had no documented personal connection to them. Neither did Aaron Sander, Brad Heika, Jason Beffert, Heather Muller, or the surviving woman whose identity has remained protected. Investigators concluded that the residents attacked on December 14th appear to have been chosen, almost at random. For the Wichita community, this reality carried its own psychological weight. Crimes motivated by personal disputes often appear isolated to those directly involved. In contrast, crimes involving apparently random victims create a broader sense of vulnerability because they suggest that ordinary daily routines alone cannot guarantee safety. Every victim in this case had been engaged in commonplace activities, driving home, spending time with friends, or simply living through another winter evening before encountering extraordinary violence. This absence of any personal connection between offenders and victims contributed to the widespread fear experienced by the community once the full details became known. Yet despite the profound suffering documented throughout the case, the Wichita Massacre also demonstrates the importance of survival, evidence, and perseverance within the criminal justice process. Andrew Schreiber survived the first known attack. His testimony later helped investigators understand how the offenders operated during the early stages of the crime spree. Even more significant was the survival of the woman who endured the final shootings at the snow-covered soccer field. According to the documented facts, after being shot, she remained motionless until she believed the offenders had left. She then walked through freezing conditions in search of help, ultimately reaching a nearby residence where authorities were contacted. Her determination to survive transformed the course of the investigation. Without her first-hand account, detectives would still have relied upon physical evidence, fingerprints, DNA, and recovered property. But her testimony connected those separate pieces into a coherent sequence of events. She provided investigators with direct evidence regarding the prolonged captivity, The forced ATM withdrawals, the transportation from the residence, and the shootings themselves. Her courage did not erase the tragedy surrounding her, nor did it lessen the losses suffered by the families of those who were killed. It did, however, ensure that the investigation began with a clear eyewitness account that became one of its strongest foundations. The investigation itself also stands as a reminder of how multiple forms of evidence can work together to establish the truth. According to the documented record, investigators relied upon survivor testimony, fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property. No single category of evidence stood alone. Instead, each supported the others, creating a consistent picture that enabled law enforcement to identify Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr within 1 day of the massacre. In many homicide investigations, uncertainty can persist for years. Some families spend decades waiting for answers that never come. In this case, although the emotional consequences would last a lifetime, investigators were able to identify and arrest the offenders rapidly because the available evidence converged in a remarkably consistent manner. The subsequent trial and decades of appellate review reflected another important aspect of the American justice system. Capital cases often involve prolonged legal proceedings because courts examine them with exceptional care. According to the documented record, the brothers were convicted in 2002 and sentenced to death. The appeals that followed eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which in 2016 reinstated the death sentences in Kansas versus Carr. Further direct review was declined in 2023, and in June 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court again upheld the death sentences. These legal developments illustrate how the judicial system continued reviewing the case for more than 25 years after the crimes occurred. Regardless of differing opinions concerning capital punishment itself, the case became one of the most significant death penalty proceedings in Kansas history because of the extensive appellate litigation that followed the original convictions. Even so, the legal history should never overshadow the human story at the center of the case. Court opinions, forensic reports, and investigative files are essential for establishing facts, but they cannot fully capture the absence left behind when lives end unexpectedly. Aaron Sander was 29 years old. Brad Heike was 27. Jason Beffert was 26. Heather Muller was 25. Linda and Valenta was 55, a respected cellist whose evening rehearsal ended in fatal violence. Andrew Schreiber survived the first attack. Another woman survived the final massacre despite suffering a gunshot wound. Behind every documented fact is a family, a circle of friends, colleagues, and loved ones whose futures were permanently altered. Remembering those individuals is ultimately more important than remembering the names of the offenders. The Wichita Massacre remains a case of enduring significance, not because of sensational details, but because it demonstrates how quickly ordinary life can be disrupted by extraordinary violence and how essential careful investigation becomes in the pursuit of justice. It also serves as a reminder that survival itself can become an act of extraordinary courage. One wounded witness, determined to remain alive long enough to seek help, became the voice that connected countless pieces of evidence and helped ensure that the truth would be documented in court rather than remain hidden beneath the snow of a December morning. More than 20 years later, the case continues to be remembered not as a story that glorifies violence, but as one that honors the victims, acknowledges the resilience of the survivors, and underscores the importance of preserving factual history with accuracy, dignity, and respect. As the story of the Wichita Massacre reaches its conclusion, it is worth pausing not on the notoriety of the offenders, but on the enduring lessons left behind by one of the darkest weeks in Kansas history. Cases such as this often become known through headlines that emphasize numbers, the dates, the victims, the charges, or the years spent in court. Yet behind every statistic was a human life that existed long before December 2000. The documented record tells us how the crimes unfolded, how investigators collected evidence, and how the courts ultimately reached their decisions. What it cannot fully convey is the silence left in the lives of families who never again shared a holiday meal with those they lost. The empty seats at gatherings that once felt routine, or the countless ordinary moments that disappeared forever when violence interrupted lives without warning. Those quiet consequences are often the longest-lasting legacy of crimes like the Wichita Massacre. Looking back across the entire sequence of documented events, a clear chronology emerges. On December 8, 2000, Andrew Schreiber survived an armed kidnapping, robbery, assault, and forced ATM withdrawals before being abandoned in a remote location. 3 days later, Linda and Valenta, a 55-year-old cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra, was followed home after rehearsal, approached under the pretense of being asked for directions, and fatally shot when she attempted to escape. Then, on the night of December 14th and into the early hours of December 15th, 5 people inside a Wichita residence endured an armed home invasion that escalated into prolonged captivity. Robbery, documented sexual violence according to court records, forced ATM withdrawals, transportation to a snow-covered soccer field, and execution-style shootings that claimed 4 lives while leaving 1 wounded survivor. Within only 7 days, the crimes had progressed from robbery to multiple murders, leaving an entire community struggling to understand how such extraordinary violence had unfolded so quickly. The investigation that followed demonstrated the importance of careful, methodical police work supported by multiple forms of evidence. The surviving woman who escaped after the shootings provided investigators with a first-hand account of the events. Fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property strengthened that testimony, creating a body of evidence that enabled investigators to identify Reginald Carr, Jonathan Carr, within 1 day of the massacre. This rapid identification did not diminish the tragedy already experienced by the victims and their families, but it prevented the uncertainty that often surrounds unsolved cases. Instead of spending years searching for unknown offenders, investigators were able to focus on preparing a case that accurately documented the crimes and presented the evidence before a court of law. The trial in 2002 resulted in convictions for numerous serious offenses, including capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and related crimes. Both brothers received death sentences. What followed was not the end of the legal process, but the beginning of decades of appellate review. According to the documented history provided, the United States Supreme Court reinstated the death sentences in Kansas versus Carr in 2016 after they had previously been overturned at the state level. In 2023, the court declined to hear additional direct appeals. Finally, in June 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court upheld the death sentences once again, closing another significant chapter in one of the state's most closely examined criminal cases. These proceedings illustrate how capital cases often continue through the judicial system for many years, reflecting the careful scrutiny applied when the most severe criminal penalties are involved. Whether viewed from the perspective of criminal investigation, forensic science, or legal history, the Wichita Massacre remains significant for several reasons that extend beyond the crimes themselves. The first is the extraordinary speed with which the violence escalated. Over only 7 days, investigators documented a progression from robbery and assault to murder and ultimately to a mass execution involving multiple victims. The second is the apparent randomness of the attacks. According to the documented record, none of the victims had a known personal relationship with the offenders. The residents targeted during the home invasion appeared to have been selected almost at random. This absence of any personal connection intensified public fear because it suggested that ordinary routines alone offered no protection against unpredictable violence. The third is the role of forensic evidence and survivor testimony. The successful resolution of the investigation depended not on one dramatic discovery, but on the careful combination of eyewitness accounts. Fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property. Each element supported the others, creating a comprehensive picture that withstood years of judicial examination. Finally, the case became one of the most prominent death penalty cases in Kansas history, illustrating the extensive legal review that accompanies capital convictions in the United States. Yet even these important legal and investigative lessons should never overshadow the people whose lives formed the heart of this story. Aaron Sander was 29 years old. Brad Heike was 27. Jason Beffert was 26. Heather Muller was 25. Linda Ann Valenta was 55. A musician whose commitment to her orchestra ended in unimaginable tragedy. Andrew Schreiber survived the first attack. Another woman survived the final shootings despite suffering serious injuries. And her courage became one of the defining reasons investigators were able to reconstruct the events so quickly. Every name represents an individual life rather than merely a victim in a criminal case. Every family experienced a loss that no verdict, sentence, or appeal could ever fully repair. Justice can establish accountability. It can document the truth through evidence and testimony. It can determine legal responsibility and impose punishment according to the law. What it cannot do is restore birthdays never celebrated, conversations never finished, or futures that ended on a cold December night. That distinction is essential when remembering cases such as the Wichita Massacre. True crime narratives carry a responsibility that extends beyond recounting dramatic events. They should preserve factual history with care, avoid glorifying those who committed the violence, and instead recognize the humanity of those whose lives were forever changed. The documented record of this case reminds us that violence is rarely confined to the immediate. Victims alone, families, friends, co-workers, first responders, investigators, medical personnel, prosecutors, and entire communities often continue carrying the emotional consequences long after court proceedings have ended. More than 25 years after those 7 days in December, Wichita continues moving forward while remembering the lives that were lost. The legal history of the case may continue to be discussed by scholars, attorneys, and historians, particularly because of its significance within American death penalty jurisprudence. Investigators may continue studying the evidence as an example of how multiple forms of forensic and testimonial proof can rapidly identify offenders. Students of criminal justice may examine the chronology as an illustration of escalating violence across interconnected crimes. But for the families of the victims, the case has always been something far more personal than a legal precedent or an investigative success. It is the story of people they loved, whose lives ended before their time. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the Wichita Massacre. Behind every court document, every forensic report, every appeal, and every historical summary are individuals whose ordinary lives were interrupted by extraordinary violence. Remembering them with accuracy, dignity, and compassion is ultimately more important than remembering the men responsible for the crimes. History preserves cases like this not to celebrate the offenders, but to honor the truth. Acknowledge the resilience of those who survived, and ensure that the voices of the victims are never lost beneath the passage of time. Before this story comes to an end, it is important to return to where it truly began, not with the offenders, the investigation, or the courtroom, but with ordinary people living ordinary lives. That perspective often disappears beneath the weight of legal records and historical summaries. The Wichita Massacre has become widely recognized as one of the most notorious criminal cases in Kansas history. Yet the individuals whose names appear in those records were never expecting to become part of history. Andrew Schreiber was simply a young assistant baseball coach whose routine was violently interrupted by an armed kidnapping and robbery. Linda and Valenta was a respected 55-year-old cellist returning home after orchestra rehearsal, following a path she had likely traveled many times before. Aaron Sander, Brad Heika, Jason Beffert, Heather Muller, and another woman gathered together inside a private residence during a cold December evening, unaware that their home would soon become the setting for unimaginable violence. Their stories remind us that crime statistics are ultimately built upon individual human lives, each carrying hopes, relationships, routines, and futures that existed long before they became associated with a criminal case. Throughout this account, the documented facts reveal a progression that remains deeply unsettling because of its speed. Within only 7 days, the known crimes escalated from robbery and assault to murder and finally to the execution-style killings of 4 people on a snow-covered soccer field. Investigators later determined that robbery served as the primary motive behind the offenses. Yet the violence repeatedly extended far beyond the taking of money or property. Andrew Schreiber was robbed, assaulted, and abandoned despite already surrendering his possessions. Linda and Valenta was shot after attempting to escape. During the home invasion, the victims endured prolonged captivity. Documented sexual violence, according to court records, repeated threats, forced ATM withdrawals, and ultimately transportation to an isolated location where 4 people were killed. Looking back at the chronology, the escalation itself becomes one of the defining characteristics of the case. It demonstrates how rapidly criminal behavior can intensify once violence becomes normalized in the actions of those committing it. Another aspect that continues to distinguish the Wichita Massacre is the apparent absence of any personal relationship between the offenders and the victims. According to the documented information, none of the victims were selected because of previous disputes or personal connections. Investigators concluded that the residents attacked on December 14th appear to have been chosen, almost randomly. That conclusion profoundly affected public understanding of the crimes. Random violence creates a unique kind of fear because it challenges the assumption that danger can always be anticipated or avoided. Every victim in this case had been engaged in completely ordinary activities before encountering extraordinary circumstances, driving home after work, spending an evening with friends, or simply returning from rehearsal are actions repeated by countless people every day. The realization that such routines could suddenly intersect with devastating violence left a lasting impression on the Wichita community and contributed to the enduring significance of the case within Kansas history. At the same time, the Wichita Massacre also illustrates the extraordinary importance of survival and perseverance. Andrew Schreiber survived the first known attack despite being kidnapped, assaulted, robbed, and abandoned. His testimony later became part of the evidence establishing the broader pattern of offenses. Even more remarkable was the determination shown by the woman who survived the shootings on the soccer field. According to the documented record, after being shot, she remained still until she believed the offenders had departed. Wounded, alone, and surrounded by freezing temperatures, she walked in search of help until she reached a nearby residence. That decision changed the course of the investigation. Her testimony became one of the earliest and most significant sources of information available to detectives. Combined with fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property, her account allowed investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events with exceptional clarity. While forensic science played a crucial role, it was the survival of a witness that connected the evidence into a coherent narrative. Her courage ensured that those who had lost their lives would not remain anonymous victims, discovered at a crime scene, but individuals whose final hours could be understood and documented with accuracy. The legal proceedings that followed further reinforced the lasting importance of the case. The convictions obtained in 2002 established criminal responsibility for numerous offenses, including capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and related crimes. Yet the judicial process extended far beyond the original trial. According to the documented record, years of appellate litigation followed, culminating in significant rulings by both the United States Supreme Court and the Kansas Supreme Court. These proceedings demonstrated the extensive legal review associated with capital punishment in the American judicial system. Regardless of differing opinions concerning the death penalty itself, the Wichita Massacre became one of the defining legal cases through which courts examined complex constitutional questions surrounding death sentences in Kansas. Even decades after the crimes, judges continued reviewing the record, reflecting the seriousness with which such cases are evaluated under the law. However, perhaps the most meaningful lesson offered by the Wichita Massacre lies beyond the investigation, the forensic evidence, or the appellate decisions. It concerns the responsibility of remembering victims with dignity rather than allowing attention to remain fixed solely upon those responsible for causing harm. True crime has become a popular form of storytelling, but its value depends upon the manner in which stories are told. When violence is treated merely as entertainment, the individuals who suffered can become secondary to the crimes themselves. A responsible examination seeks the opposite outcome. It recognizes that behind every documented event was a person whose life possessed meaning long before becoming associated with a criminal case. Aaron Sander, Brad Heike, Jason Beffert, Heather Muller, and Linda and Valenta should be remembered not only for the way they died, but for the lives they lived before December 2000. Andrew Schreiber and the surviving woman should be recognized not simply as witnesses, but as individuals who endured unimaginable circumstances and nevertheless contributed to the pursuit of justice. Their resilience became an essential part of the historical record. More than 25 years after those 7 days in December, the Wichita Massacre continues to be discussed because it combines several elements rarely found together in a single criminal case. A rapidly escalating crime spree, multiple victims across separate incidents, substantial forensic evidence, surviving eyewitness testimony, swift identification of the offenders, convictions supported by extensive evidence, and decades of appellate review reaching the highest courts. Yet none of these features should overshadow the simplest truth at the center of the story. A community lost members whose absence could never be replaced. Families carried grief that no legal decision could erase. Friends remembered conversations that unexpectedly became their last. Survivors continued living with memories that no passage of time could completely remove. Justice succeeded in establishing accountability, but accountability and healing are not the same thing. Courts can pronounce verdicts. Investigators can identify offenders. Forensic evidence can establish facts with remarkable precision. History can preserve the sequence of events for future generations. None of those achievements can restore what violence permanently took away. As this account concludes, the Wichita Massacre remains more than a historical case file or a notable legal precedent. It stands as a reminder of the fragility of ordinary life, the importance of meticulous investigation, the value of truthful testimony, and the enduring resilience of those who survive unimaginable circumstances. Above all, It reminds us that the true measure of remembering such tragedies is not how much attention is given to those who committed the crimes, but how faithfully we preserve the memory of the people whose lives were forever changed by them. That is the legacy that deserves to endure long after the headlines have faded and the courtroom has fallen silent. Although the documented history of the Wichita Massacre reaches its legal conclusion with the convictions, appeals, and the subsequent decisions of the courts, the broader significance of the case continues long after the final judicial opinions were issued. Some criminal cases become known because they remain unsolved, leaving families without answers. Others become remembered because they change investigative practices or influence legal debates. The Wichita Massacre belongs to the latter category. According to the documented facts, the crimes were investigated quickly. The offenders were identified within a day of the final attack through survivor testimony and multiple forms of physical evidence. And the legal process continued for decades because of the death sentences imposed in 2002. As a result, the case occupies an important place not only in Kansas criminal history, but also in discussions about forensic evidence, capital punishment, and the lasting consequences of violent crime. Yet beyond those legal and historical discussions lies a more enduring truth: every court decision, every investigative report, and every historical summary exists because real people experienced extraordinary suffering during 1 week in December 2000. Throughout this story, one theme has remained constant. The victims were living ordinary lives before violence entered them without warning. Andrew Schreiber did not set out expecting to become the first known survivor of a week-long crime. Spree, Linda, and Valena finished an orchestra rehearsal expecting to return home safely, as she undoubtedly had on countless previous occasions. Aaron Sander, Brad Heike, Jason Beffert, Heather Muller, and another woman gathered inside a private residence, sharing what appeared to be a normal evening among friends. Nothing in the documented record suggests that any of them had reason to believe they were in danger, or that they had any connection whatsoever to the offenders. That absence of personal connection remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the Wichita Massacre. The crimes are not driven by a personal dispute between people who knew one another. Instead, investigators concluded that the victims were selected through opportunity rather than familiarity, reinforcing the terrifying reality that ordinary routines can sometimes intersect with extraordinary acts of violence. The investigation demonstrated the importance of combining different forms of evidence rather than relying upon a single source of information. According to the documented record, detectives assembled survivor testimony, fingerprints, DNA evidence, physical evidence, and recovered property into one comprehensive case. Each category served a different purpose. Witness testimony established the sequence of events from the perspective of those who experienced them. Fingerprints and DNA provided scientific confirmation linking individuals to the crimes. Physical evidence supported the timeline reconstructed by investigators. Recovered property further connected the offenders to the offenses under investigation. Together, these independent sources reinforced one another, creating a consistent body of evidence that allowed investigators to identify Reginald Carr, Jonathan Carr rapidly. The case illustrates an important principle of criminal investigation. The strongest conclusions often emerge not from one dramatic discovery, but from multiple pieces of evidence pointing toward the same explanation. Equally significant was the role played by the surviving witnesses. Andrew Schreiber's account helped investigators understand how the earliest known crime in the series had unfolded. His experience established a pattern involving armed confrontation, forced ATM withdrawals, robbery, assault, and abandonment. Days later, The surviving woman from the December 14th home invasion provided investigators with first-hand information about the prolonged captivity. The robbery, the forced ATM withdrawals, the transportation to the snow-covered soccer field, and the shootings themselves, without adding speculation beyond the documented facts. It is reasonable to recognize the extraordinary determination required for an injured person to remain alive under such circumstances and then seek help. Her decision to pretend to be dead until the offenders had left and then walk through freezing conditions to find assistance became one of the defining moments of the investigation. Her survival did not diminish the tragedy surrounding her, but it ensured that investigators began their work with crucial first-hand information that strengthened every subsequent stage of the case. The legal proceedings that followed reflected the complexity of prosecuting crimes involving multiple victims and numerous criminal offenses. According to the documented record, the brothers were convicted in 2002 of capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and related offenses before receiving death sentences. Those convictions did not conclude the legal process. Instead, years of appeals followed, eventually leading to significant judicial decisions. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court reinstated the death sentences in Kansas versus Carr. In 2023, further direct review was declined. In June 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court again upheld the death sentences, closing another major phase of litigation. Regardless of differing perspectives on capital punishment, these proceedings illustrate the extensive judicial scrutiny applied in cases involving the ultimate criminal penalty. The courts examined the case repeatedly over more than 2 decades, demonstrating the deliberate pace at which capital cases often proceed through the American legal system. For historians and legal scholars, the Wichita Massacre remains significant because it combines several distinct elements within a single documented case. It involved multiple crime scenes spread across several days. It featured different categories of violent crime, including robbery, kidnapping, sexual violence documented in court records, and murder. It included surviving eyewitnesses whose testimony proved critical to the investigation. It relied upon multiple forms of forensic evidence. Finally, it generated decades of appellate litigation that reached both the Kansas Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of the United States. Each of these elements contributes to the case's lasting importance within discussions of criminal justice. Yet the historical importance of the case should never overshadow its human dimension. Behind every legal document was a family waiting for answers. Behind every piece of evidence was an individual whose life had been altered forever. Behind every appeal were memories that no judicial ruling could erase. The names remembered in connection with this case deserve to be remembered for more than the violence that ended or transformed their lives. Linda and Valenta should also be remembered as a musician dedicated to her orchestra. Aaron Sander, Brad Heika, Jason Beffert, and Heather Muller were individuals with futures that extended beyond the final hours described in court records. Andrew Schreiber and the surviving woman demonstrated remarkable resilience under circumstances few people could imagine. Their experiences became essential to the pursuit of justice. But they also remind us that survival often carries its own lifelong burdens. One of the responsibilities involved in telling true crime stories is recognizing the distinction between understanding violence and sensationalizing it. The documented facts of the Wichita Massacre are already deeply disturbing without embellishment or speculation. There is no need to invent conversations, emotions, or dramatic twists when the historical record itself clearly demonstrates the seriousness of what occurred. Remaining faithful to documented evidence honors both the victims and the integrity of the historical record. It allows the focus to remain where it belongs, not on glorifying those responsible, but on preserving the truth about what happened and acknowledging the lasting impact upon everyone affected. As this account finally draws to a close, the Wichita Massacre stands as a reminder that justice is measured in several different ways. Investigators sought the truth through evidence. Prosecutors presented that evidence before a court. Judges reviewed the convictions through years of appeals. Those processes established legal accountability according to the law. But another form of justice exists in the careful preservation of memory. By remembering the victims accurately, respecting the documented facts, and refusing to let sensationalism replace compassion, their stories continue to matter beyond the courtroom. More than 25 years after those 7 days in December 2000, the legacy of the Wichita Massacre endures not because of the notoriety of the offenders, but because the lives of the victims, the courage of the survivors, and the determination of investigators ensured that the truth would not be forgotten. In the end, that truth remains the most enduring record of all. As we reach the final chapter of this account, the events of December 2000 can be viewed not only as a sequence of documented crimes, but also as a lasting reminder of how fragile ordinary life can be. The Wichita Massacre did not unfold over months or years. According to the documented record, it occurred within the span of only 7 days. That brief period forever changed the lives of numerous families, left an entire community searching for answers, and created one of the most significant criminal cases in the history of Kansas. The chronology itself remains striking. A robbery and kidnapping on December 8th. A fatal shooting on December 11th. A home invasion, prolonged captivity, forced ATM withdrawals. Documented sexual violence, according to court records. Transportation to an isolated snow-covered soccer field. And the execution-style killings on the night of December 14th and the early morning of December 15th. Each event built upon the one before it, demonstrating a rapid escalation that would later become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Yet despite the brutality of those crimes, the lasting legacy of the Wichita Massacre is not found solely in the violence itself. It is found in the determination to uncover the truth, preserve the historical record, and remember the people whose lives were forever altered. Throughout this series, one principle has guided the narrative: remaining faithful to the documented facts. The available record tells us that Reginald Carr, 23 years old, and Jonathan Carr, 20 years old, had recently moved to Wichita before beginning the crime spree. Investigators concluded that robbery served as the principal motive, although the violence repeatedly exceeded what would ordinarily be associated with theft alone. The record tells us that Andrew Schreiber survived the first known attack after being kidnapped, forced to withdraw money from several ATMs, assaulted, robbed, and abandoned. It tells us that Linda Ann Valenta, a 55-year-old cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra, was followed home after rehearsal, approached under the false pretense of being asked for directions, and fatally shot after attempting to escape. It documents that 5 people inside a residence on December 14th were restrained, robbed, threatened, subjected to documented sexual violence, according to court records, forced to participate in ATM withdrawals, transported to an isolated soccer field, and shot, leaving 4 dead and 1 survivor. It records that investigators relied upon survivor testimony, fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property to identify the offenders within 1 day of the massacre. It documents that both brothers were convicted in 2002 and sentenced to death before decades of. Appeals culminated in significant decisions by the United States Supreme Court and the Kansas Supreme Court. Those are the facts preserved within the historical record, and they remain powerful without requiring embellishment. In many ways, the Wichita Massacre demonstrates why careful documentation matters. Every investigation depends upon evidence collected accurately and interpreted responsibly. Every criminal trial depends upon testimony that can be evaluated alongside forensic findings. Every historical account depends upon preserving what can actually be supported by the available record rather than allowing speculation to replace established fact. This approach is especially important in true crime storytelling. Cases involving extreme violence often attract attention because of their shocking nature. But responsible storytelling should never confuse shock with understanding. The purpose of examining cases like the Wichita Massacre is not to glorify those responsible or transform tragedy into spectacle. Instead, it is to understand what happened, recognize the experiences of the victims, appreciate the work of investigators and the courts, and preserve an accurate historical account for future generations. Another enduring lesson concerns the importance of survivors within the justice system. Andrew Schreiber survived the earliest known attack despite enduring kidnapping, robbery, and physical assault. His testimony later helped establish the broader pattern of criminal behavior. The surviving woman from the December 14th home invasion became even more central to the investigation. According to the documented facts, after being shot, she remained motionless until she believed the offenders had departed before walking through freezing conditions to find help. Her actions not only saved her own life, but also provided investigators with crucial firsthand information about the sequence of events. While forensic science supplied fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property, her testimony connected those individual pieces into a comprehensive account. Her courage serves as a reminder that even amid overwhelming violence, individual determination can significantly influence the pursuit of justice. The legal history of the Wichita Massacre also reflects the deliberate nature of the American judicial system when addressing capital cases. Following the 2002 convictions, the appeals process continued for decades. According to the documented information, the United States Supreme Court reinstated the death sentences in Kansas versus Carr in 2016 after they had previously been overturned at the state level. Additional direct review was declined in 2023, and in June 2026, the Kansas Supreme Court again upheld the death sentences. Regardless of personal views regarding capital punishment, the extensive appellate process illustrates the careful review given to cases involving the most severe criminal penalties. The legal proceedings became part of the case's historical significance, extending its influence beyond Wichita into broader discussions concerning constitutional law and the administration of justice in Kansas. Yet legal significance should never eclipse personal loss. Behind every procedural ruling stood families whose grief did not end when verdicts were announced or appeals concluded. Aaron Sander was 29 years old. Brad Heike was 27. Jason Beffert was 26. Heather Muller was 25. Linda and Valena was 55. Each represented an individual life filled with relationships, ambitions, routines, and plans that extended beyond December 2000. Their names deserve to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. Likewise, Andrew Schreiber and the surviving woman deserve recognition not simply as witnesses, but as individuals whose resilience contributed directly to establishing the truth. Their survival became part of the reason this case could be reconstructed with such clarity. Looking back after more than 25 years, the Wichita Massacre remains significant because it combines several important elements rarely present together within one criminal case. It involved multiple victims across different incidents, a rapidly escalating sequence of crimes, diverse forms of forensic evidence, surviving eyewitness testimony, swift investigative success, lengthy appellate litigation, and continuing historical importance. These factors explain why the case continues to be examined by historians, legal scholars, investigators, and those interested in criminal justice. However, perhaps the greatest value in studying the Wichita Massacre lies not in its notoriety, but in the reminder that every case file ultimately represents real human lives. Statistics can summarize the number of victims. Court opinions can analyze legal questions. Investigative reports can describe evidence in precise detail. None of those documents can fully express the emotional weight carried by parents who lost children, siblings who lost brothers or sisters, friends who lost companions, or communities that suddenly realized violence could arrive without warning. Those quieter consequences often remain long after headlines disappear. They're also the reasons accurate remembrance matters. The passage of time inevitably transforms even the most widely reported crimes into historical events. New cases emerge. Public attention shifts. Memories fade. Yet preserving the truth remains an essential responsibility. By documenting what happened carefully, avoiding unsupported speculation, and keeping the focus upon the victims rather than the offenders, stories such as the Wichita Massacre continue serving a meaningful purpose. They remind future generations of the importance of justice, the value of evidence, the courage of survivors, and the enduring humanity of those whose lives were forever changed. In the end, the Wichita Massacre is remembered not because history needs another story about violence, but because history has an obligation to remember the people who endured it. That obligation asks us to preserve the facts faithfully, to acknowledge the suffering honestly, and to ensure that the names of the victims are remembered with the dignity and compassion they deserve. That, above all else, is the legacy worth carrying forward. The story of the Wichita Massacre ultimately comes to an end not with the final appeal or the final court ruling, but with a broader reflection on what remains after justice has run its course. Courtrooms eventually empty. Investigative files are archived. News coverage fades as new events replace old headlines. Yet for the families of the victims, for the survivors, and for the community that experienced one of the darkest chapters in Kansas history, the passage of time does not erase memory. More than 25 years after those 7 days in December 2000, the case continues to stand as a solemn reminder that extraordinary violence can emerge from circumstances that initially appear painfully ordinary. The victims were not participating in dangerous activities. They were not involved in conflicts with the offenders. According to the documented record, they were simply living their lives, returning home from work, spending time with friends, or driving through familiar streets. That reality remains one of the most unsettling truths preserved by this case. Throughout this series, the facts have revealed a sequence that unfolded with alarming speed. On December 8th, Andrew Schreiber became the first known survivor after being robbed, assaulted, kidnapped, and forced to withdraw money from several automated teller machines before being abandoned in a remote area. 3 days later, Linda and Valenta lost her life after being followed home from orchestra rehearsal and shot when she attempted to escape. Then, during the night of December 14th and the early morning of December 15th, 5 people inside a private residence experienced hours of captivity, robbery, repeated threats, documented sexual violence according to court records, forced ATM withdrawals, transportation to a snow-covered soccer field, and execution-style shootings that left 4 people dead while 1 woman survived despite serious injuries. Investigators quickly assembled fingerprints, DNA evidence, physical evidence, recovered property, and eyewitness testimony, allowing them to identify Reginald Carr and Jonathan Carr within 1 day of the massacre. In 2002, both brothers were convicted of numerous offenses, including capital murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, rape, sexual assault, and related crimes before receiving death sentences. Appeals continued for decades, eventually producing major decisions by the United States Supreme Court in Kansas versus Carr. The court's refusal to hear additional direct appeals in 2023, and the Kansas Supreme Court's decision in June 2026 to uphold the death sentences once again. Those facts form the historical framework of the case. They explain what happened, how investigators responded, and how the legal system ultimately addressed the crimes. Yet history is more than chronology. It is also memory. One of the enduring responsibilities of true crime storytelling is deciding what deserves to be remembered most. It is easy for notorious offenders to dominate public attention because their actions are shocking. Their names become associated with newspaper headlines, documentaries, and legal opinions. But that focus can unintentionally push victims into the background, reducing them to supporting characters within stories about the crimes committed against them. Responsible storytelling seeks a different balance. The names that deserve the greatest attention are those of the people whose lives were interrupted, rather than those who caused the interruption. Andrew Schreiber should be remembered not simply because he survived an armed kidnapping, but because he continued living after an experience few people could imagine. Linda and Valenta should be remembered not only because she became a homicide victim, but because she was an accomplished musician whose commitment to her orchestra reflected years of dedication to her art. Aaron Sander, Brad Heike, Jason Beffert, and Heather Muller should be remembered as individuals whose futures extended far beyond the final hours documented in court records. The surviving woman, whose identity remains protected, deserves recognition for the remarkable courage that allowed her to remain alive. Seek help and contribute to the investigation that followed. Her testimony became an essential part of the pursuit of justice, but before she became a witness, she was simply another person whose ordinary evening was transformed into an unimaginable struggle for survival. Another lasting lesson concerns the importance of evidence. The Wichita Massacre illustrates how modern criminal investigations depend upon a careful integration of multiple sources of information. According to the documented record, investigators did not rely upon a confession or one decisive clue. Instead, they combined eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, DNA, physical evidence, and recovered property to reconstruct the crimes with remarkable precision. Every category of evidence supported the others. The surviving witness described the sequence of events. Forensic findings confirmed physical presence. Recovered evidence reinforced the timeline. Together, these independent sources established a comprehensive account capable of withstanding years of judicial scrutiny. The case therefore remains significant not only because of its tragic outcome, but also because it demonstrates the value of meticulous investigative work grounded in objective evidence. Equally important is the legal history that followed. Capital punishment cases often involve lengthy appellate review because of the irreversible nature of the sentence imposed. According to the documented information provided, this case remained active within the judicial system for more than 2 decades. The repeated examination of the convictions and sentences illustrates the extensive safeguards built into the appellate process, whether one supports or opposes the death penalty as a matter of public policy. The Wichita Massacre stands as an example of how thoroughly courts review cases involving the most severe criminal sanctions available under American law. That legal history has become part of the broader legacy of the case, extending its significance beyond Wichita into discussions of constitutional law and criminal justice. Yet perhaps the most meaningful lesson cannot be found in forensic laboratories, courtrooms, or legal opinions. It lies in the recognition that violence leaves consequences extending far beyond the immediate. Victims. Families experience empty chairs at dinner tables, Friends lose companions with whom they expected to share decades of memories. Communities lose neighbors, colleagues, artists, and mentors whose contributions can never be replaced. Survivors often continue carrying emotional and physical scars long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. These consequences rarely appear in court documents, yet they represent the longest-lasting impact of violent crime. Understanding that broader human cost is essential if true crime is to serve any purpose beyond simple curiosity. Cases like the Wichita Massacre remind us that justice is not measured solely by convictions or sentences. Justice also involves preserving the truth with integrity, acknowledging suffering without sensationalism, and ensuring that victims are remembered as complete human beings rather than merely as names attached to a criminal investigation. Accuracy matters because it honors those who experienced the events. Compassion matters because every documented fact represents a person whose life carried meaning long before becoming part of a court record. Responsibility matters because future generations will understand these events through the stories that survive. As this account closes, the Wichita Massacre remains one of the most significant criminal cases in Kansas history, not because of the notoriety of those responsible, but because of what the case ultimately teaches about resilience, investigation, accountability, and remembrance. The crimes unfolded within only 7 days, yet their consequences extended across decades of legal proceedings and continue to influence historical discussion today. The investigation demonstrated the power of evidence. The courts demonstrated the complexity of justice. The survivors demonstrated extraordinary courage. The victims remind us why every effort to preserve the historical record must begin and end with respect for human life. Long after the legal arguments have concluded and the headlines have disappeared, that remains the most important truth carried forward by the Wichita Massacre. It is not a story that should be remembered for the violence alone, but for the enduring commitment to truth, justice, and the dignity of the people whose lives were forever changed during one cold week in December 2000.